Assalamualaikum. In today's lesson, we're starting chapter 10, infectious diseases. So it has objective 10.1, which says define the term disease and explain the difference between an infectious disease and a non-infectious disease, right? Limited to sickle cell anemia and lung cancer. State the name and type of causative organism pathogen of each of the following diseases. So these are the five that we have to cover: cholera, malaria, tuberculosis, which is also known as TB, HIV/AIDS, right? Smallpox and measles. Detailed knowledge of the structure is not required. For smallpox, variola, and measles, only the name of the genus is needed. Right? Explain how cholera, measles, malaria, TB, and AIDS are transmitted. Discuss the biological, social, economical factors that need to be considered in the prevention and control of cholera, measles, malaria, TB, and HIV/AIDS. A detailed study of life cycle of malarial parasite is not required. Okay. So discuss the factors that influence the global patterns of distribution of malaria, TB, HIV/AIDS, so these three diseases, and assess the importance of these diseases worldwide. Then objective 10.2 is about antibiotics, where we are supposed to outline how penicillin acts on bacteria and why antibiotics do not affect the viruses. Explain and outline how bacteria become resistant to antibiotics with reference to mutation and selection, and discuss the consequences of antibiotic resistance and the steps that can be taken to reduce its impact. So let's start with the chapter now. So talking about infectious diseases, disease is actually, or if you just talk about a disease itself is an illness, right? Or a disorder of body or mind, right? So there can be something wrong with the body, or the person is not mentally well. So he might not be able to actually perform his day-to-day life activities and might not be actually able to be an effective member of the society, right? So this can eventually lead to poor health. Each disease is associated with signs and symptoms. Now remember, there's a difference between these two. Signs are actually quantitative, something that the examiner or the doctor would be seeing, something that they can they can take readings of, they can measure it, right? Symptoms are the conditions and the characters that the person is feeling, the patient is feeling actually, right? So symptoms are the conditions and characters which the person feels. Like, for example, the person may have a headache, right? The person may be shivering, he may be nauseous, he's having chills or dizziness, right? So these are all symptoms because the patient is actually feeling them, right? But how would the doctor know, right? The doctor, let's say if the person is having fever, the doctor would take his temperature, and this is how he would know that yes, there is high temperature, right? So it's quantitative, right? For example, the person is having headache, so the headache may be due to high blood pressure, right? So the doctor would actually take his blood pressure, right? And if it's high, so definitely the headache is because of that high blood pressure, right? A person is sweating, maybe there could be that the blood pressure is low, right? So all of these are signs because these can be quantified, right? These can be verified. Symptoms are felt or noted by the patient himself. Then infectious diseases are caused by pathogens. So pathogens are the disease-causing organisms, and these infectious diseases are actually transmissible, right? They can be transferred from one person to another, and they can spread like between individuals within a population, right? So here we talk about the differences between infectious and non-infectious diseases. So infectious diseases, as we were just already discussing, these are diseases caused by organisms which we call as pathogens, and these infectious diseases are also known as communicable diseases, as definitely they are passed from one infected person to another person who is not infected, right, or an infected person. And some of the diseases like also affect animals, and then they are passed from animals to humans. Like, so in this case, the vectors are animals, right? They can pass from animals to humans. So the examples are cholera, malaria, HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, right? So these are the examples of infectious diseases, okay, which can transfer from person to person, right? Or from animals to humans as well. For example, tuberculosis can actually transfer from cattle to humans, right? Malaria, the vector is a mosquito, right? So non-infectious diseases, these are the long-term degenerative diseases that are not caused by pathogens. So these non-infectious diseases are not caused by pathogens. So these can be, let's say, some diseases of the gas exchange system, right? So for example, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, emphysema, and chronic bronchitis, as we just discussed in the last chapter, right? Then lung cancer. So these are not caused by any pathogens, right? So these are basically lifestyle. A person is so smoking, so he's suffering from these diseases. So these are not caused by infections, and they are not transmissible, right? They will not be, like that person will not be able to affect or infect any other person because of these, right? Other than that, cardiovascular diseases as well, right? Like atherosclerosis. So these are non-infectious diseases. Then inherited or genetic diseases as well, like sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis. These are genetic diseases. So they cannot be like a person cannot give this disease to another person like in a form of an infection, right? So these are diseases which are like gas exchange, cardiovascular system diseases, inherited genetic diseases. These are non-infectious diseases, right? And sometimes diseases such as can be caused by malnutrition as well, or mental diseases as well. So these are non-infectious diseases. For infectious diseases to happen, there needs to be a pathogen, right, which is actually the causative organism. Right? So there's a difference between infectious and non-infectious diseases. So infectious diseases, some diseases may be transmitted without a person even showing any symptoms. The person does not know himself that he's suffering from a disease, and such person is actually known as a carrier, right? Or we sometimes use the term vector for this as well. And this person definitely will be asymptomatic, but can pass on the infection to the other person who is not infected. Then pathogens pass from one host to another, as we were just discussing, right? And this cycle is known as transmission cycle, right? As it passes from one host to another. So this is transmission cycle. And yes, the 5 diseases that we have to talk about in detail are cholera, malaria, HIV/AIDS, measles, and TB. Okay, besides these, you need to know a few terms. For example, endemic. So endemic is a disease that is always present in a population, right? So like it will be there, for example, cholera, right? So if it's a like underdeveloped country, the sway system is not working well, right? So there are chances that there will be these regular like cases of cholera would go on there, right? Or for example, chickenpox, right? Or measles. So these are always present in a population, right? The epidemic is a rapid spread of the disease to a large number of people in a given population within a short period of time, right? So, for example, just we discussed and cholera is endemic, like would be present in a population, but there might be like certain like at a certain instant, like there can be an increased amount of cholera cases like at one given time, right? Or for example, you may take example of COVID. It started from China, so it was an epidemic. Like it suddenly there was a rapid spread of the disease to a large number of population, right? So initially they were affected, but now after that it became a pandemic because then it spread to different parts of the world because people were traveling, right? So this epidemic, if it is actually affecting large number of people in a given population, then we call it epidemic, right? Pandemic is actually when you see an increased number of cases throughout the continent or across the world. So this is how this COVID has become a pandemic now, right? So incidence is the number of people who are diagnosed with a disease over a period of time, right? For example, from 2010 till 2015, these many people were diagnosed with a certain disease. Okay? So it tells you a number of people who are diagnosed with the disease. Okay? So that's incidence. Prevalence होता है the number of people with the disease at any one time. Okay? Number of people with the disease who are having the disease at any one time. Okay? At any one particular time is known as prevalence, or incidence होता है over a period of time. Right? So these are a few terms that you need to know. All right then. These are the diseases that we'll be doing. Cholera, the causative agent or pathogen is Vibrio cholerae, which is a bacterium, right? So it's a bacterium, Vibrio cholerae. Malaria is caused by Plasmodium, right? Which is actually protoctist, and it is actually a eukaryote, right? It's not a prokaryote. Like bacteria is a prokaryote, right? Virus does not fall into category of eukaryote or prokaryote at all, right? But protoctist is actually a eukaryote, right? So there are 4 species of Plasmodium, but Plasmodium falciparum is the one which actually causes the most severe form of malaria. There are other forms of malaria as well, Plasmodium malariae, Plasmodium ovale, Plasmodium vivax, but Plasmodium falciparum is the one which actually is the more prevalent, right? And this protoctist is eukaryote, right? Then tuberculosis is also a bacterial disease, and the causative organism is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, right? So Mycobacterium tuberculosis And if it is actually being spread from the cattle um, to the person, it is known as Mycobacterium bovis. Okay? It comes from the cow, Mycobacterium bovis. Right? If the person is drinking unpasteurized milk, so the person and the cow definitely suffering from this disease, so it can be transferred from the milk to the person. So it's Mycobacterium bovis, okay, from the animal to the person, and Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Then HIV/AIDS, it's human immunodeficiency virus. That's the name of the virus, and definitely virus does not fall into the category of either prokaryote or eukaryote, right? So it's human immunodeficiency virus, right? And besides that, we'll be talking about measles as well. So measles is caused by measles morbillivirus. This is highly infectious, right? And definitely a virus, right? So HIV, measles, both of them are caused by virus. Tuberculosis and cholera are caused by bacteria, and malaria is caused by Protoctis, right? Which is a plasmodium. So let's discuss about cholera, which is caused by Vibrio cholerae. So that's the causative bacterium. The disease is foodborne as well as waterborne. It means it can be or it can spread through water as well as through food. So contaminated water or sewage water, right? If somehow that is consumed by people, or if let's say the food is prepared using the same water, or the person himself is infected, and like they are not maintaining proper hygiene, and they are actually handling the food. So all of these can actually lead to transmission of Vibrio cholerae into other person. So distribution of this bacteria is mostly in the underdeveloped countries, poor countries, Asian countries, African countries, and Latin America. The incubation period, which is actually the time of when the pathogen enters the body until the time of the onset of symptoms. So the incubation period is 2 hours to 5 days. So, and site of action is mostly the small intestine, and the diagnosis is microscopic examination of the feces, because this is where the bacteria will be found, right? Now, how does Vibrio cholera actually act? So Vibrio cholera actually secretes or releases a toxin which is known as cholarogen. So it releases this toxin, and this toxin inhibits the cells in the small intestine, right? Because its target areas is the small intestine. So Vibrio cholerae will secrete this or release this toxin, which is cholarogen. It inhibits the small intestinal cell, and because of that, what happens? There is increased secretion of chloride ions into the gut lumen, right? Chloride ions start leaving the cell. And now, because the chloride ions are leaving the cell, the solute potential becomes low, and the water potential at the same time becomes high. So water also follows and goes out of the cell via osmosis, right? So this causes the cell to release a large quantity of water, right? Because definitely the salt is being lost. Now, this bacteria actually is transmitted in water, right? Contaminated food, definitely feces, because infected person would be releasing the causative organisms there. Then in cooking utensils, vegetable which is irrigated with infected water. So all these actually are the cause of transmission, right? So this disease is actually then endemic in areas with poor sanitation, right? So endemic disease is like, because it will be you at any time you go at any place, you will find the disease there, right? So that is endemic. So countries which have poor sanitation or areas which have poor sanitation, cholera would be an endemic over there, right? Now, the symptoms are loss of fluid, definitely, like since there are a lot of salts or there is electrolyte imbalance actually here, right? Because the salts are being lost. So there is an electrolyte imbalance, right? So loss of fluid, water is being lost. This causes dehydration. The person becomes very weak, right? And severe diarrhea, and it is known as rice water or rice watery stools, right? It's like a whitish in color. It's not just the clear liquid, it's whitish in color. So we call them rice water stools, right? Rice water stools. All right, then, talking about the prevention. So the prevention basically includes development of a proper sewage system, right? Because this is actually what is causing the problem here, right? The water is not treated, it is not chlorinated, because chlorinated water actually would kill bacteria, but it's not being treated actually, right? So people do not have access to clean drinking water. Definitely, cooking can be inadequate. Cooking is not done properly, so maybe the meat that is used, the food that is cooked is like not prepared properly, right? And always tracing cholera epidemic, because now in these conditions there is a chance that an outbreak can happen, right? Because, for example, especially in summer days, right? Because when the temperature is high, right? And like there are a lot of infections going on during those days. So an epidemic can also, there can be an outbreak, right? A number of people would start having the disease, right? So that the same endemic can become epidemic. Now, vaccines are there, but they have only short-term effect, right? And they're not very effective, because if the person continues to live in such environment, right, there is no like proper space system developed. So these will eventually will not last long. The antibodies would form, but they will not be that as much effective. Now, the treatment basically is actually symptomatic treatment. And by symptomatic treatment, we mean because the person is actually um, losing water, losing electrolytes. Okay, so the person is actually rehydrated. So it can be done using oral rehydration therapy, or you might be familiar with ORS, right? So it contains this perfect balance of electrolytes and water. Like you can dissolve that in water, and actually it would restore the body's electrolyte balance then. ORS, or the whole procedure is known as oral rehydration therapy. Use of glucose is also effective, right? It is taken right into the blood, and using antibiotics only in severe cases, right? Because again, we need to reduce the risk of antibiotic resistance, right? So in severe cases, antibiotics have to be given. So that's about the prevention and the treatment. Now, let's talk about the next disease that we have to talk about. It's malaria. Now, malaria is caused by Protoctist, which is a eukaryote, right? And the parasite is known as Plasmodium, right? So the parasite is Plasmodium, and it is caused by the female Anopheles mosquito. So that is an insect vector, right? So female Anopheles mosquito is actually the cause of transmitting this infection, right? Distribution is mostly in the tropics, because like the places are warm, then like there's a lot of rain, so there are huge pools of water over there, so damp places. So this is where actually the malarial parasite would grow, right? Site of infection is mostly liver, red blood cells, and brain, right? So these are the areas where these malarial parasites actually have effect on the body. The incubation period can be a week up to a year as well, right? So people who are living in such a country or such an area where malaria is actually an endemic, right? So in those places, person, it would take maybe a year for the person to develop the symptoms, right? Diagnosis again is microscopic examination of the blood, because this parasite is found in the blood. And besides that, dipstick tests are also used these days. So in dipstick tests, there are antibodies or immobilized antibodies there. And if the blood contains parasite, so parasites have antigens on their surface. So these antibodies actually would react with those antigens, and it can be known that the person is suffering from malaria or not, because the lab report would take some time to actually give some results, but dipstick test will give you instant result, right? So this is something that like people have started using now. So now the actual life cycle of malarial parasite is actually not included in our syllabus, right? But you need to know the basics. So this Anopheles mosquito feeds on the human blood, right? And the human blood, which is actually like if the person is infected, right? So that infected blood, because it's Anopheles mosquito is feeding on the blood of the person. Whereas if the person is infected, he or she would have gametes in them, right? Because so these gametes, pathogen gametes, are there in the blood of the person, right? But when they're taken up by the mosquito, they would fuse in the mosquito's gut, right? These gametes do not fuse in the human, right? So gametes, individual gametes are there, but they only fuse in the mosquito's gut. And then they travel to the salivary gland, right? Now, once this mosquito bites another person, it this pathogen is then released along with anticoagulant, right? Because a mosquito, as it has to suck the blood, it has to suck the blood, so it actually releases anticoagulant, so the blood does not clot and it can suck on the blood easily. So during that process, it actually releases that pathogen into the person's blood, right? Now, The malaria can be transmitted to placenta as well through the mother. It would be like it can easily pass through the fetus because again, it is there in the blood, right? It can also be transferred through blood transfusion if the person is already suffering from malaria and the same person donates blood to someone else. So through the blood transfusion, the other person will also get malaria. So Plasmodium multiplies in both humans and mosquito, right? So its life cycle, okay? A part of the life cycle is there in the humans, a part of the life cycle is there in the mosquito, right? And people can actually become immune from malaria as well, right? But only as long as they're constantly in contact with the disease. So if they're living in an area where this disease is prevalent, right? So they will develop an immunity against malaria, but only in the time till they're constantly in contact with the disease. Once they leave the area, right, they lose the immunity. So this is the mode of transmission of malaria. So you can pause the video, you can read about it, and then we'll move on to the next one. All right, then let's talk about how this disease can be prevented. So there are three main methods through which this spread of malaria can be prevented. The first one of them is reducing the number of Anopheles mosquitoes in an area. So definitely like a self-explanatory. You kill the mosquito, you spray them via DDT, like so you actually just destroy the population. Then reducing the chance of being bitten by these mosquitoes, so you can use repellents, using drugs as well. So these drugs are actually using prophylactically, and by prophylactically I mean they actually the person actually does not have the disease, right? But they are actually taking this disease as a preventive measure, right? So these these medicines or these drugs are taken as a prophylactic measure, right? As a preventive measure, right? So this would prevent Plasmodium infecting the humans. So these are the three main methods. Now let's talk about the first one. So as Anopheles mosquitoes, specifically the female ones, right? They are the vectors because this is caused mainly by these female mosquitoes. They transmit Plasmodium between the human hosts, right? So the transmission cycle of the malaria can be broken, right? This transmission cycle has to be broken. So either you destroy the mosquitoes or you destroy the larva, right? So this transmission cycle has to be broken, right? Or at least you can reduce it, right? How it can be reduced? We can reduce the number of mosquitoes, and this can be done by spraying these insecticides such as DDT, right? Besides that, we can also spread oil over the surface of the water bodies because it is the water bodies actually these population of mosquitoes thrives upon, right? So you can spread oil on the water bodies that the mosquitoes breed in such as the ponds, right? And irrigation of or drainage ditches. The mosquitoes actually lay their eggs in water. So the eggs are found in the water. Those eggs definitely would hatch and larva would come out. So the larvae actually breathe air at the water surface. But if there is oil layer on the water surface, the larva would not be able to breathe. So this will actually kill the larva, right? So this is one way. Okay, you can actually break this transmission cycle. So either you use insecticides or kill the mosquitoes, right? Or you can spread oil over the water surfaces where there are breeding areas for these mosquitoes, or you can drain those marshes, right? Where this unnecessary pooling of water, you can actually drain that. Then you can also ensure that ponds and irrigation or drainage ditches are stocked with fish that actually feed on mosquito larvae, right? So you can actually introduce those fish there. They would eat the larvae. So definitely this transmission cycle is broken. Then spraying these water bodies with a preparation containing a bacterium. So this bacterium is known as Bacillus thuringiensis. Okay? Bacillus thuringiensis. What it does, it kills the mosquito larvae. So it is effective against the mosquito larvae, but it is not toxic to other organisms. So you can actually make a preparation of this, right? And you can spray that on the water bodies, right? So it will not have any effect on any other organism in the water body, but it will only kill the mosquito larvae. So, but the thing is, these mosquitoes, they lay their eggs in even smaller puddles, right, or pools of water. So therefore, practically it becomes very impossible to control all the breeding sites, right? So this is the first method. So how can we reduce the number of Anopheles mosquito? If 100% we are not actually going to achieve this, but at least we can try, right? At least some percentage can be achieved. Now, talking about the drugs that can be taken as a prophylactic or preventive measures. So these are chloroquine, mefloquine. These are the well-known drugs that are taken, or anti-malarials basically. So they are taken if they're taken before, right? So definitely then they become preventive, right? So during or after a visit to a location where malaria is prevalent, so you can take these medicines. However, the thing is the use of these drugs has resulted in drug-resistant strains of Plasmodium, right? Or sometimes the drugs are expensive, everyone cannot afford that. Or sometimes it will also happen the person is having some side effects. So they would definitely not continue with their medicine. But one of the best methods to prevent malaria is to avoid being bitten in the first place. And this is a like one thing that a person can actually do at his own level, right? So the people in malarial zones should actually sleep under bed nets, which can also be soaked periodically in an insecticide to increase effectiveness, right? And should try to avoid exposing their skin at dust. So definitely, so they can wear long sleeves, right? They should try to cover their skin as much as possible, right? In places where mosquitoes are more active. So WHO actually in 1950 tried to actually eradicate malaria from world, right? But what happened is that this whole program was mainly unsuccessful. One reason was that Plasmodium became resistant to the drugs because the drugs were being used anti-malarials. Plasmodium became resistant, right? And Anopheles mosquito also became resistant to DDT. So the insecticide was also not working, right? Because Anopheles mosquito developed resistance, and the Plasmodium itself, the parasite itself, became resistant to the drugs. Right? So this whole program was not 100% successful. So to control malaria, so since it cannot be eradicated 100%, right? So we can simply control it, right? So how can it be controlled? So WHO mostly works with the government bodies, right? And they can actually work with health systems to improve diagnosis. They can improve the supply of, or work on improving the supply of effective drugs. Different drugs can be used in combination to reduce drug resistance, right? Promoting appropriate methods to prevent transmission, like for example, use of biological controls to target the larvae. As we just discussed, the Bacillus thuringiensis, right? So you can use that to target the larvae basically. Or insecticide treated bed nets, right? So you can use these at least to control the effect of malaria, right? So recent scientific advances actually regarding the control of malaria are simple dipstick test, as we just discussed earlier, right? So these have these immobilized antibodies on them. And since the blood contains parasites have antigens on it, so a diagnosis can be made, right, much faster. Okay, does not require any laboratory report. Entire Plasmodium genome now has also been sequenced, right? So which will actually help in development of vaccines. So they are actually working on it, but still no such vaccine has been developed till now, but they're still working on it. So these are some recent scientific advances that they're working on. So coming to the treatment, so basically it's anti-malarial drugs, right? They can be taken as a prophylactic measure. Prophylactic means preventive measure, right? So there is drugs are quinine and mefloquine. Then chloroquine, actually what it does, its effect is actually on the parasite, so it inhibits the protein synthesis of the parasites, right? Then like they have actually also noticed the strains of drug-resistant plasmodium in different countries. And some doctors can also misdiagnose initial malarial symptoms because the initial symptoms are mostly low-grade fever, uh, like so most of the like symptoms actually resemble the symptoms of influenza, right? So like initially there can be some misdiagnosis, right? And some people also do not realize that they lose immunity when they re-enter their home country after years of being away. Right? So the temporary immunity that was there, it actually finishes and they lose this immunity. All right. The third disease that we have to discuss about is AIDS, or acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. It is caused by human immunodeficiency virus. And basically, the causative pathogen is this virus, right? Human immunodeficiency virus. And AIDS is actually not one disease, but it's a syndrome, right? So there are a number of diseases, right? Which actually like, because the immunity is low in this case, right? So a lot of diseases actually are involved here. And this virus is actually a retrovirus. Retrovirus means it contains RNA. So if you recall from a discussion in chapter 1 when we were discussing viruses, so viruses can have either RNA, right, or they can have DNA, which can be single or double stranded, right? Single or double stranded. In this case, there is RNA, right? And this is the reason we are calling it as a retrovirus, right? It contains RNA. Now, so this picture is from your book. So if you see here, so there is this protein core that you're looking at. So this one, the first one is the outer lipid membrane that you see, right? And then you can see the protein capsomeres as well. So protein capsomeres, okay? So we have this outer lipid membrane, right? What else you see here is this protein core, and inside the protein core is this RNA, right? And besides RNA, there are two enzymes. So one of them is known as reverse transcriptase, right? And the other one is protease. And it is this reverse transcriptase actually, which is actually, if again you can recall from chapter 6, right? When protein synthesis has to take place, so first DNA, right, it undergoes like, because transcription happens, and then messenger RNA is formed. Right, this messenger RNA then actually leaves the nucleus, goes into the cytoplasm, where like translation takes place and protein synthesis happens, right? So here in this case, it is actually happening in reverse. So it actually means since this virus contains RNA, this RNA is actually being converted into DNA. So this is a reverse process. And the enzyme responsible for that is reverse transcriptase, right? So transcription, at the level of transcription, this RNA is converted into DNA, right? Unlike what we studied in eukaryotic cells, the DNA was being transcribed into messenger RNA, right? So here, RNA is being transcribed into DNA. So this is done by reverse transcriptase. This is why we call it as a retrovirus, right? So this HIV is a retrovirus, which means its genetic material is RNA, not DNA. And just so that you know, the viruses that contain DNA, they are known as enteroviruses. So let me write that here as well. ठीक है, जो जिनमें DNA होता है, we call them enterovirus. ठीक है, so उनको हम बोलते हैं enterovirus. और here RNA जिनको जिनमें होता है, we call them as retroviruses. Okay. So once inside the host cell, the viral RNA is converted back to DNA, hence the term retro, right? So here RNA is converted into DNA, okay? And then this is incorporated into human chromosomes. So this is what happens. RNA converts into DNA, and then this DNA is incorporated into the human chromosomes. This is how the virus infects and destroys the cells, and mostly it affects the cells of the immune system, because the name itself is human immunodeficiency syndrome. So it affects the cells of immune system. It affects the helper T cells. Okay? So it lymphocytes को affect कर रहा है. Okay? So it mainly affects these lymphocytes, okay, which are known as helper T cells, right? These helper T cells control the immune system response to infection. Since this virus is destroying these cells, right? So number of lymphocytes already becomes less. Okay? So person's immunity will become very low. So as the number of these cells reduce, the body is unable to defend itself against infection. This allows a range of pathogens to cause a variety of opportunistic infections. So opportunistic infections are the ones, since the immunity is low, so now these pathogens will strike, right? And they will actually affect the person. So mostly, for example, TB, tuberculosis, it's an opportunistic infection, right? Or influenza. So AIDS, as we were just discussing, it is not a disease. It's not just one disease. It's a collection of these opportunistic diseases, which are actually associated with immunodeficiency, because the person's immunity is so low that different pathogens can actually affect the person, right? And the person will get infected. So HIV, right, is an infective agent, right? Because this virus is a pathogen involved here. So AIDS is called an acquired immunodeficiency, right? We call it as acquired, okay? Because the causative pathogen here is this virus, right? So we call it as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, right? To distinguish it from other types. For example, inherited form. Inherited form, you must have heard about Down syndrome. ठीक है, वो inherited है. But since this is acquired, ठीक है, तो मे बी बिकॉज ऑफ सम लाइफस्टाइल किसी का इस तरह का है, ठीक है, और मे बी दे आर यूजिंग ड्रग्स, ठीक है, सो इट कैन बी लाइक बिकॉज उसी तरह ये स्प्रेड हो रही है, सो इट्स नोन एज एक्वायर्ड इम्यूनो डेफिशिएंसी सिंड्रोम, ठीक है, इट्स नॉट इनबिल्ट, इट्स एक्वायर्ड. Okay, so it infects and destroys the T helper cells. Remember the lymphocytes. Okay, T helper cells, basically they are destroying them. So immune system becomes weak. It is not responding effectively. Body becomes vulnerable to other diseases. Okay, so common cold and tuberculosis, right? So AIDS is a conglomeration of opportunistic diseases. It's a syndrome. It is not just one disease. Okay then, so this HIV virus is not transmitted by a vector, unlike in malaria, right? Because it is actually the causative organism here in this case is virus, and virus needs a human body or a living host to survive. So virus is unable to survive outside of the human body, right? So generally it is transmitted by sexual intercourses, definitely bodily fluid exchange of then it can be transmitted through in blood transfusion as well, right? If the person, let's say, is infected and or maybe the person is asymptomatic, it doesn't know that he's actually suffering from AIDS. So that person, if they donate blood, so they can actually transmit the infection to the other person, right? Then it can travel across placenta from mother to the child, right? Needle sharing. So again, drug addicts, they're sharing these needles, right? So it can transfer through that. And if someone has discovered to have HIV, they're actually asked to contact the sexual partner immediately, because again, it can easily transmit through these processes, right? So we actually go for tracing. Then pregnant women also, they're advised not to breastfeed their children because this virus actually is found in the breast milk, right? And for this, if it's known that a pregnant woman is suffering from AIDS, right? So she should be given antiretroviral drug. Retroviral because again, this virus contains RNA, right? Okay, so antiretroviral drug before delivery. So this has to be given so that she develops antibodies, and then antibodies are passed on to the child before it's born. So talking about the prevention, preventing this disease, spread of this disease actually is difficult, right? One reason is that the virus has a very long latent stage, right? And the thing is that the person who has the virus, but it's asymptomatic, right? It doesn't know he's carrying the viruses, and they will keep on affecting other people, right? So this occurs because the virus can change its surface proteins, right? So you cannot actually make a vaccine against it as well, right? There's no one particular antigen. So it becomes very difficult for human immune system to recognize it as well. So your body would also not be able to recognize because the antigen keeps on, surface proteins keep on changing. So there's no particular like antibody that can be made against it, right? And definitely a vaccine cannot be developed. So, but for prevention, what can be done? Blood donations, okay, if they are being done, so they need to be screened. So they need to be screened for HIV and heat treated to kill any viruses. HIV positive mothers and the babies can be treated with drugs. Definitely, they can be given these antiretroviral drugs, right? Then condoms, famiderms, and dental dams can be used to decrease infection risk. Definitely. Then education programs about how the virus is transmitted. Awareness is really, really important, right? So people should be encouraged to change their behaviors, change their lifestyles, right? Protect themselves and others as well, right? And then intravenous drug users definitely, they should be encouraged not to share the needles, right? So this is like some points through which it can be controlled. It can be prevented actually. Now, controlling is actually like first and foremost, you need to contact the person uh, with which this person who's actually now having AIDS has come in contact with. So contact tracing. So again, the subsequent testing of those contacts who have been in close contact with the person, right? So you need to screen the blood donations. Public health measures have to be actually, they have to be addressed, right? By spreading this HIV testing of the population has to be done. Educational programs need to be done. These needle exchange schemes, they have been set up in some places to exchange use needles for new sterile ones. Then encouraging high risk groups. So high risk groups are homosexuals, definitely prostitutes, injecting drug users. They need to be tested at regular intervals, right? Then using antiretroviral drugs. So socioeconomic status of a person or country with HIV can also determine how it is controlled. So like in developed countries or high income countries, so HIV positive mothers are mostly advised not to breastfeed their children, right? And then definitely they would resort to bottle feeding because we know the virus is being transmitted in breast milk. But in low income countries like, or middle income countries, breastfeeding, like definitely we cannot actually ask them not to breastfeed because it actually provides immunity as well. Not against virus, but there are other antibodies which are passed on through the mother's milk to the child, right? Or for example, cholera, right? So in that case, mother would definitely continue feeding her child. So coming to the treatment, as such, there is no cure for this disease, right? It's just that you can slow down the spread. And yes, a number of varieties of drugs are actually used, but they are mostly for symptomatic treatments, like because the person actually suffering from other diseases, since immunity is low, so we actually go for symptomatic treatments, right? Then there definitely are side effects of those drugs as well. Okay, then cost also matters. What we can do is simply just increase the life expectancy. So a drug is actually given that actually may help in boosting the immune system, and the drug is actually known as zidovudine, right? This drug actually is similar to the DNA nucleotides. So if you remember the DNA nucleotide, it contains this ribose sugar, a phosphate group, and it contains a nitrogenous base. In this case, here the nucleotide, this drug is, since it is similar to DNA nucleotide, so it is similar to the nucleotide that contains the base thymine, right? So this zidovudine actually, it binds to the viral enzyme, which is reverse transcriptase. So remember the one which is actually like catalyzing the reaction of like conversion of RNA into DNA, right? So this drug, okay, which is similar to DNA nucleotide, it would bind to the enzyme reverse transcriptase. If this reverse transcriptase, the enzyme is inhibited, its function or its action would be blocked. This stops the replication of the viral genetic material, right? Because it will not be converted into DNA then, right? So the replication of this viral genetic material is stopped and leads to an increase in some of the body's lymphocytes, because basically what was happening is that this virus is destructing the helper T cells. Okay, so if you are actually stopping this reverse transcriptase, so number of actually body lymphocytes would remain unharmed maybe, right? So this is something that can be done. So with that, we have finished discussing about the human immunodeficiency virus, right? Which is causing AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. All right, now let's talk about the disease tuberculosis or TB, which is caused by bacterium, and the pathogens are Mycobacterium tuberculosis and Mycobacterium bovis. So Mycobacterium bovis actually causes infection mostly in cattle, right? And the one that causes infection in humans is Mycobacterium tuberculosis, right? But then this Mycobacterium bovis can also transmit to humans as well, right? Because since it's found basically there in the cattle, so it can transmit from unpasteurized milk or uncooked meat, undercooked meat basically, from the animals to the humans as well. So transmission is, yes, airborne droplets. So a person sneezes or coughs, so it can be transmitted, right? So this Mycobacterium tuberculosis is expressed mostly as airborne droplets. Undercooked meat, so in this case, Mycobacterium bovis is responsible, right? Or unpasteurized milk. So distribution is worldwide, right? Incubation is actually weeks till years as well, right? And the site of infection, the primary site of action is actually here. The infection happens mostly in the lungs. Like as secondary, it happens in the lymph nodes, bones, and guts, right? So it starts with the lungs, but then it spreads to different parts of the body. And diagnosis is mostly microscopic examination of the sputum, right? Because the sputum would definitely contain the bacteria there, and chest X-ray as well, right? Because primarily it infects the lungs. So this is how the diagnosis will be done. Now, the symptoms are mostly the person will start coughing blood, right? Because the disease takes very long to show symptoms as well, right? So coughing blood, the person definitely coughs, chest pain, right? Shortness of breath will happen, fever, definitely the bacterial infection, fever is there, sweating, and weight loss, right? So these are all the symptoms that the person is actually having, right? So they can be actually tested by those, the blood can be tested for bacteria, it can be cultured, right? So transmission, as we said, yes, is airborne disease. So it travels like the droplets travel in the air in aerosol droplets, right? The pathogen or the bacteria. It can also infect the malnutrition person, like the person is already malnourished, the immunity low hai, so it can actually happen. So mostly jo patients who are carrying this HIV infection as well, ठीक है, जिनको AIDS है, so they are actually are at a risk of getting TB as well, right? Especially then TB can affect people who are actually living in overcrowded conditions, ठीक है, because the more closer they are to aerosol droplets, वहाँ पे बहुत ज़्यादा chances and they're at a risk. Then opportunistic infection of AIDS, as we just discussed, right? Because immunity already low है. Then TB transmission can come from cattle, as we just discussed, जो Mycobacterium bovis है. So it can be like unpressurized milk है या undercooked meat है, उसकी वजह से आ सकता है. So 1940s when it actually started with antibiotics and introduced streptomycin, right? And 1950s they started with vaccines, right? So disease was thought to have been eradicated, now but it's on the rise definitely. In Pakistan, you must be familiar, like usually at the first day of birth, right? A child or infant actually gets vaccinated by this BCG. Let me write it here. Okay, so this is a vaccine that is given for tuberculosis, right? So usually the first day of life or the very next day. So BCG vaccine actually is involved in our EPI program, which is expanded program of immunization, which has been given to us by the World Health Organization. So BCG vaccine is given to the children, right? So this BCG vaccine actually can protect 70 to 80% of people who are receiving it. So effectiveness of vaccine reduces with age, okay? Because initially when it is given, antibodies are produced, but the effectiveness reduces with age, unless exposed to TB, okay? So like, because if the person is then again infected or exposed to TB, so person will definitely start to develop antibodies against it, okay? But eventually, like if the person is not exposed to TB, like कभी भी जिंदगी में उसका exposure नहीं हुआ से, so the immunity that was developed by the vaccine आहिस्ता आहिस्ता खत्म हो जाती है, कम हो जाती है, असल खत्म नहीं होती बट कम हो जाती है. So TB can still be transmitted between cattle and human, so as we just said discussed, ठीक है. So इसी वजह से जो cattle है, ठीक है, उनका routine test किया जाता है बार बार, ठीक है. Milk is always pasteurized, right? And then contact tracing is also very important because again, like overcrowded area में people who are living, ठीक है, so airborne infection है, so they can actually get infected with tuberculosis. So these are all prevention. So remember, vaccination is always a prevention, right? The treatment is through the medicine or through the antibiotic in this case. Basically, it's a bacterial infection. So that would be the treatment. Okay? So treatment is antibiotic, but prevention is vaccination. Because through vaccination, the person will start to make antibodies, right? Okay, so treatment, when diagnosed, the patient needs to be isolated, right? And then uses several drugs to ensure, because the bacteria has to be killed, right? So many drugs have to be used, not just one medicine, right? And then this whole course of medicines or antibiotics actually has to be done for around 6 to 9 months, right? So the reason is that the bacteria is slow growing and it is not sensitive to drugs, right? So many antibiotics are given and it takes around 6 to 9 months for this whole course to finish. So the patient has to complete the whole course. Okay? Otherwise, what will happen if the person, let's say, takes the medicine for a month and feels better and stops taking the medicine, the bacteria will become resistant. Okay? So the patient needs to complete this whole course. So for this, actually, a DOTS program is introduced. DOTS is known as Direct Observational Treatment Program. Someone needs to constantly ensure that the infected person or person who has TB is actually taking the drugs or medicines regularly. So this is known as DOTS, right? Direct Observational Treatment Program, right? Now, some of the bacteria survive the treatment as well, again, because if the person, let's say, has not completed the entire course, so they would mutate and eventually they will become drug resistant. And the drugs mostly which are used are isoniazid and rifampicin. So these are the mostly recommended drugs for patients suffering from tuberculosis, right? So these days, like multiple drug resistant like strains have actually, they are on the rise. So multi-drug resistant TB, these are on the rise. And they are actually now resistant to the recommended drugs, isoniazid, rifampicin. They're not able to act on these because they have become resistant now. Okay, so that much about tuberculosis. Coming to the last one, which is measles. So measles is caused by a virus, right? And this is highly infectious. And the name of the virus is measles morbillivirus. This is the name of the virus, right? And in this case, the virus is transmitted by millions of tiny droplets, which are discharged from the nose and mouth of the infected person when they cough or sneeze, right? So again, airborne. So it is therefore caught when a person like breathes in these droplets or touches a surface which is contaminated by them, because virus can survive several hours on a surface. Same is the case with जैसे आपने कोरोना वायरस का सुना होगा, it can survive for several hours on a surface. So that's the reason hand sanitizing की बात कर रहे हैं कि gloves पहने, mask पहने, ठीक है? So infected individuals are then contagious from the onset of the symptoms, ठीक है? Until about 4 days after the rash first appears. ठीक है? So definitely the person gets infected. ठीक है? Symptoms start होते हैं और symptoms start होने के बाद 4 days के बाद the rash appears first. ठीक है? So person is very contagious during those days. Also, like they need to isolate themselves. Then many people who are actually deficient in vitamin A, ठीक है? They can also become infected with this measles. Right. So symptoms are virus actually enters the body, infects the respiratory tract, right? Then rash appears, okay, after the 4th day. Then definitely it's affecting the respiratory tract, the runny nose, cough, watery eyes. So this is the reason, this is why the person is contagious, because runny nose, cough, the person will be coughing, the person will be sneezing. So those droplets will actually be there in the surrounding air, right? Watery eyes, so the person is actually touching their eyes as well, okay? And then let's say they touch any other surface, a virus can survive on any other surface, right? Inside the cheeks, there will be white spots developing as well, right? So these are some symptoms. Then if goes untreated, then pneumonia as a complication, sinus infection, okay? These will get blocked, sinusitis, okay? Then brain can damage as well. So these are all the symptoms of measles, right? So if goes undetected or complications occur, then definitely pneumonia can eventually lead to death as well if it is not treated. So how can measles be prevented and how can we control them? So measles is highly contagious, but it can be effectively prevented by individuals being vaccinated with the measles. So there is a vaccination for measles, right? And again, this MMR vaccination is actually given as a combination of 3 vaccines, which is measles, mumps, and rubella. Okay, MMR. So generally, like it is given around 9 to 13 months of age. So first dose जब लगते हैं, then booster dose is given at the age of 3 to 4. ठीक है, so 2 doses दिए जाते हैं इसके, so MMR. ठीक है, mumps, measles and rubella. So 3 एक साथ 3 vaccines लगाई जाती हैं. ठीक है, एक ही उसके अंदर. ठीक है. So uptake of MMR vaccine has fallen over the last 2 decades as a result of now discredited study that MMR vaccine is linked to autism. ठीक है, so मतलब शुरू में किसी ने कहा कि जी इससे autism हो जाता है, but there is no link. ठीक है, but again because something is there in the market, so people start believing that. So last 2 decades it has been stopped. Worldwide, but Pakistan में still is there. पाकिस्तान में हमारा जो EPI program है, उसमें we have to give this vaccination to the child, right? So there's overwhelming evidence that there is no link between vaccine and autism, right? So in most individuals, measles is a non-serious infection, but it can cause complications in some cases, leading to pneumonia and brain encephalitis, right? So other than that, it can easily, because if the child is vaccinated, so definitely will not have measles. But mostly people who are not vaccinated, they get affected by measles. So this much about the diseases, right? Let's talk about the global factors which are affecting the distribution of 3 diseases, right? As per our syllabus specifications, we have to talk about malaria, we have to talk about tuberculosis and AIDS, right? So global factors which are affecting the distribution of these diseases. So let's talk about malaria first. So now, as you know, malaria is caused by one of the 4 species of Proctis plasmodium, right? But these are transmitted to humans by the insect vector, which is female Anopheles mosquito. So these mosquitoes, they favor habitats which have high rainfall, high temperatures, high humidity, so mostly tropics, right? So this means malaria can occur where these mosquitoes are present, and as a result is found throughout the tropics and subtropics. Because 80% cases malaria के हमें अफ्रीका में मिलते हैं. ठीक है, so these mosquitoes are found in Africa. They also have longer lifespans and prefer biting humans than animals. Right, the Anopheles mosquitoes which are found in Africa. So in 1950, World Health Organization tried to eradicate the whole world from malaria, but that was again unsuccessful. One reason, plasmodium became resistant to the drugs. Second reason, the Anopheles mosquito became resistant to DDT. Right, so insecticides were not active on that. Okay then, so there is an evidence that there is an increasing number of malaria epidemics due to climatic and environmental changes that favor the spread of Anopheles mosquito, right? So yes, these diseases are there, okay? So they are endemic, but epidemics can also, actually there can be an outburst of these diseases in certain conditions. For example, जब climatic changes or environmental changes, ठीक है? उस केस में तो some of these favor the spread of the mosquitoes, ठीक है? So ज़्यादा बारिश हो रही है, ज़्यादा damp है, humid environment है, so it actually ज़्यादा इनकी breeding ज़्यादा हो जाती है. So this is actually something that is related to the environmental changes. Social factor that has caused the number of cases of malaria in Africa in particular to increase in recent years is the increased migration of people due to war, right? So people are migrating, and when the people are migrating, if they are already infected, they would carry the parasite with them, right? So the parasite would be transported from the areas which have infection to new regions now, right? And if the Anopheles mosquito is breeding in the new region as well, then the mosquito vector will transfer the disease from one human to the next, right? So this is one social factor also. Okay, then let's talk about the global factors affecting the distribution of tuberculosis. So tuberculosis also has a worldwide global distribution, right? जैसे मलेरिया की जब हम बात करें तो mostly confined to African countries में mostly ज़्यादा है, ठीक है? So tuberculosis has worldwide global distribution. TB is spread quickly from person to person through droplets released by coughing or sneezing of an infected person, ठीक है? With the active form of illness, ठीक है? And are inhaled by uninfected persons. है जो actively इस वक्त infected है, उससे uninfected person में चला जाएगा. The droplets contain the TB causing bacteria which is known as Mycobacterium tuberculosis, right? TB, however, spreads more quickly among people living in overcrowded conditions. So again, distance maintenance, isolation, यही चीजें करनी होंगी prevent करने के लिए. So people who sleep close together as well in large numbers are very high risk. So TB primarily affects the homeless and people who live in poor substandard housing. Some people may be affected with TB but not show symptoms. Again, asymptomatic people are there. Okay, so bacteria is inactive. Okay, the disease is not spreading at all. However, if the person becomes infected with HIV, okay, so in that case, TB can be the first opportunistic infection for HIV positive people, right? So inactive होगा, ठीक है? But then what happens if the same person contracts HIV, तब उसमें सबसे पहले जो opportunistic disease होगी वही TB, ठीक है? उसका जो bacteria will become active now, ठीक है? Definitely people who are malnourished उनके अंदर बहुत ज़्यादा इसके chances हो जाते हैं. High rates of TB can also be found in cities with population of migrants from countries where TB is more common, ठीक है? So again, क्योंकि human to human contact है, sneezing और droplet infection है, so people who are migrating from different countries, ठीक है? तो वहाँ पे definitely they can actually take it to new places as well. So for example, parts of London have much higher TB rates than the rest of UK. Right? Then the last that we have to talk about the global factors affecting the distribution of HIV or AIDS. HIV/AIDS again has a worldwide global distribution, but is especially prevalent in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Okay? Mainly due to lack of education, okay, about how this virus is transmitted, so awareness nahi hai. Okay? They don't have access to items like rejection nahi kar rahe, chilling during intercourse, right? So they're not using condoms, right? And then because of that, okay, awareness nahi hai, so mostly they're actually spreading there. So 70% of the world's deaths from AIDS occur in Africa. Okay? So again, poor educational, poor socioeconomic conditions. So AIDS is widespread throughout the sub-Saharan Africa. It's a serious public health problem because HIV infection makes people more vulnerable to existing diseases such as malnutrition, TB, malaria, ठीक है। अब ऑलरेडी अगर अफ्रीका में रह रहे तो अफ्रीका में मलेरिया बहुत कॉमन है, ठीक है। ऑलरेडी HIV की वजह से उनकी इम्यूनिटी लो है, तो दे कैन गेट मलेरिया एज वेल, ठीक है। TB, अपॉर्चुनिस्टिक इन्फेक्शन हो सकता है, malnutrition definitely, poor countries हैं, ठीक है। So all these actually, so because of this HIV, the person will have serious health problems. So this table here is just for you to see the global impact of these diseases. So it's annual worldwide incidence and mortality rates table. So just compare, like malaria, it has around 207 estimated number of cases in 1 year, right? But estimated number of deaths are 6,30,000, right? Then tuberculosis is 8.6 million, ठीक है, but 1.3 million deaths. उसके अंदर भी 3,20,000 are HIV positive people, right? Then HIV/AIDS is 2.3 million and 1.6 million estimated number of deaths from AIDS-related diseases. Okay, so this is just for you to see here. Look at the global impact of these diseases, right? So the last objective that we have to cover in this chapter is antibiotics. So antibiotics are actually selective toxins, right? So selective toxins, like some of them would actually kill or destroy the bacteria. Some of them would prevent their growth in some way, right? So these are selective toxins, right? So they kill or disable the pathogen without harming the host, right? So they don't have any effect on the host, any damaging effect on the host, right? But they would kill or disable the pathogen. They only work on bacteria. Definitely, that's the reason they're known as antibiotic. And these are generally derived from living organisms. Okay? So bacteriostatic means if they are actually stopping or preventing the bacterial growth. Okay? So if they stop it altogether or prevent it from growing, then such antibiotics are known as bacteriostatic. Okay? Static, रोक दिया उसको. Bactericidal, ठीक है, are the ones which actually kill the bacteria. So bactericidals are the one mostly जो cell wall damage कर देती हैं bacteria की. So we have two types of antibiotics, bacteriostatic and bactericidal. So bactericidal are the ones which will kill the bacteria by destroying the cell walls. Bacteriostatic are the ones which would stop or prevent the bacterial growth. So antibiotics are drugs, okay, that kill or stop the growth of bacteria, okay, and we know the bacteria are prokaryotes, but they would not harm the cells of infected organism. Yes, they are derived from living organisms. So penicillin is one example, which is derived from fungi. It is produced from certain fungi, and the genus is Penicillium, right? While others can be made synthetically, right, in the laboratory. Okay, so but penicillin is actually found in the fungi. So antibiotics work by interfering with the growth or metabolism of the target bacterium, because mainly they're affecting the bacterium. So either they would affect their growth or metabolism, right? Antibiotics target a variety of processes. So because we said that these are selective toxins, so they can actually target synthesis of bacterial cell walls, ठीक है, एक्टिविटी ऑफ प्रोटीन्स इन बैक्टीरियल सेल सरफेस मेम्ब्रेन्स, उनको जाके इनहिबिट कर देंगी, ठीक है, बैक्टीरियल एंजाइम एक्शन को खत्म कर सकती हैं, बैक्टीरियल डीएनए सिंथेसिस, बैक्टीरियल प्रोटीन सिंथेसिस. So they can actually target either of these. So specifically बनाई जाती हैं, ठीक है. So they would actually target a variety of processes in the bacteria, right? So talking about penicillin, the thing is that bacterial cell walls are made up of peptidoglycans, right? So this provides a structural support there. So, but peptidoglycans are long molecules of peptides and sugars, right? So it's not just sugar, it is peptidoglycans. So it's peptides, okay, and sugars. These peptidoglycan molecules are held together by cross links that form between them, right? So these peptidoglycan molecules, they're held together by cross links, right? And these cross links form between them. When a new bacterial cell is growing, it secretes an enzyme which is known as, excuse me, which is known as autolysis, right? As a new bacterial cell is growing, okay, so definitely the cell wall actually also has to grow, right? So a bacterial cell which is growing, it secretes enzyme which is known as autolysin. Autolysin creates small holes in the bacterial cell wall because it has to stretch. ठीक है, उसको grow होना है, ठीक है. So these small holes actually would help this bacteria to grow in size, right? And these are the enzymes. These holes allow the bacterial cell wall to stretch, with new peptidoglycan molecules then joining up via the crosslinks described above. ठीक है, because already these peptidoglycans are joined together or held together by crosslinks. So as the bacterial cell is growing, ठीक है, so autolysis are enzymes which would actually punch small holes in the bacterial cell wall, which would allow them to stretch. ठीक है, अब क्योंकि नया सेल बन रहा है, सेल वॉल भी बन रही है, तो न्यू पेप्टिडोग्लाइकेन मॉलिक्यूल्स भी बनेंगे. ठीक है, they will also join up by the crosslinks. What does penicillin do? Penicillin stop these crosslinks forming. ठीक है, वो crosslinks नहीं बनने दे रही है. ठीक है, but how it is being stopped? Because it is inhibiting the enzymes that catalyze their formation. Right? So the enzymes which are responsible for formation of these cross links, क्योंकि जब पेप्टिडोग्लाइकेन मॉलिक्यूल को आपस में बॉन्ड बनाना है, क्रॉस लिंक्स बनाने हैं, so that actually that activity is also enzyme link. वो enzyme inhibit हो जाता है यहाँ पे. ठीक है, so it stops those cross links forming by inhibiting the enzymes that catalyze their formation. However, the autolysis keep creating holes. Autolysis अपना काम कर रहे हैं, those are also enzymes. ठीक है, so autolysis अपना काम करते जाएंगे, they will keep on punching holes. But जो cross linking होनी है new peptidoglycan molecules के बीच में, वो नहीं हो रही है. What is happening? The walls of the bacteria will become weaker and weaker. ठीक है, so as bacteria live in watery environment, so think about it, holes भी उसके अंदर ज़्यादा हो गए. ठीक है, and it already lives in a watery environment. ठीक है, and it takes up water by osmosis. Their weakened cell walls eventually burst as they can no longer withstand the pressure exerted on them from within the cell. This means penicillin is only effective against bacteria that are still growing. ठीक है, so mature bacteria के खिलाफ ऐसा इतना effective नहीं है. They are effective against bacteria that is still growing. ठीक है, so autolysis can no longer create holes and no more cross links between peptidoglycan molecules are formed once the growth of a bacterium is complete. So autolysis mostly growing bacteria के अंदर ही काम कर रहे हैं. That punching hole and stretching the cell वो mature cells में नहीं हो रही है. ठीक है, because जब mature हो गया cell, जब fully grown हो गया, तो its cell wall does not need to expand. तो expand होने की जरूरत ही जब ही है when it is growing. ठीक है, so this is what penicillin does. ठीक है, it inhibits the enzymes which would actually catalyze the reaction, this cross-linking between the peptidoglycan molecules. So you may pause and read about it. Right? So penicillin and other antibiotics, remember, they do not affect the viruses. Okay? Because viruses, they do not have like cell walls actually, right? They, as such proper cells तो नहीं है वो. ठीक है, they do not have cell walls. Therefore, they cannot be targeted. क्योंकि अब जब ये काम कर रहा है तो basically इसका effect किस चीज पर है? Cell wall के ऊपर. ठीक है, so and therefore it cannot be targeted in any of the ways that an antibiotic targets a bacterial cell. ठीक है, when a virus replicates, it uses the host cell's mechanism for transcription and translation. Right? Not even these processes can be targeted. अब क्योंकि वायरस जब रेप्लिकेट कर रहा है तो वो ट्रांसक्रिप्शन और ट्रांसलेशन अपने होस्ट सेल के मैकेनिज्म को अफेक्ट करे, तो एंटीबायोटिक्स में यहाँ पे कोई रोल नहीं होगा. ठीक है, क्योंकि एंटीबायोटिक काम करिए कहाँ पे? सेल वॉल के ऊपर. राइट, as antibiotics do not bind to the proteins that host cells use in this process, क्योंकि basically it is working against the bacterial cell. ठीक है, तो host cell के ऊपर वैसे भी कोई effect नहीं होगा. So penicillin is not effective against all the bacteria though. ठीक है, for example tuberculosis, उसके लिए हम definitely अलग medicine, अलग antibiotic use करेंगे, because the bacteria may have thick cell walls, ठीक है, with reduced permeability, enzymes which break down penicillin. So it depends. Okay, every bacteria definitely will be different. ठीक है, so जरूरी नहीं हर एक के अंदर thin cell walls हो, किसी में thick cell walls होंगी, so it is not permeable, whereas the penicillin would not be able to enter. ठीक है, then the other bacteria might contain some enzymes which can break down penicillin. ठीक है, so it is not effective against all the bacteria. All right then let's talk about antibiotic resistance. When a bacterial population, like within a bacterial population, there is a variation caused by mutation. So we know, like let's say if the person does not complete the antibiotic course, right? So bacteria will become resistant. They can undergo mutations. Okay, and the same happens like all the time in species as well. So a chance mutation might cause some bacteria to become resistant to an antibiotic. Okay, for example, let's say, ठीक है, वो bacteria penicillin से resistant हो गया. When the population is treated with this antibiotic, the resistant bacteria would not die, क्योंकि वो तो resistant हो गया, penicillin उसके ऊपर काम नहीं कर रही है. ठीक है, so अब what is happening in this case? The resistant bacteria will continue to grow. वो ग्रो भी करता जाएगा, रिप्रोड्यूस भी करता जाएगा, बिकॉज अब नाउ इट डज नॉट हैव एनी कंपटीशन फ्रॉम अदर नॉन रेजिस्टेंट बैक्टीरिया। तो जो नॉन रेजिस्टेंट बैक्टीरिया वो तो खत्म हो गए पेनिसिलिन से, बट जो रेजिस्टेंट है स्ट्रेन वो खत्म नहीं हो रहा है, तो दे विल कीप ऑन मल्टीप्लाइंग एंड ग्रोइंग। ठीक है, so therefore the genes for these antibiotic resistance then are passed on with a much greater frequency to the next generation. तो वही जो हम नेचुरल सिलेक्शन की बात करते हैं, ठीक है, so these are the ones which will move from the next generation, move to the next generation. So bacteria can only have one copy of each gene. ठीक है, so अगर वहाँ पे mutant gene आ गया है, so that it will have an immediate effect on any bacterium possessing it, because bacteria is prokaryotic, one cell है खाली, ठीक है, so it only has one copy. तो अगर वही copy mutant है, ठीक है, तो फिर वो definitely जब replicate होगी तो it will be there in the daughter cells as well. Over time, the whole population of bacteria becomes antibiotic resistant, because the antibiotic resistant bacteria are best suited to the environment. ठीक है, ज़्यादा उन्हें सर्वाइव करना है तो डेफिनेटली ये इनको फेवर कर रहा है. So this is an example of evolution by natural selection. Some pathogenic bacteria have become resistant to penicillin as they have acquired genes that code for the production of an enzyme which is known as beta lactamase. ठीक है, और हम इसको penicillinase भी बोलते हैं. ठीक है, so some have, क्योंकि mutations हुई हैं, तो एक नया एंजाइम वहाँ पे बनना शुरू हो गया, like definitely एंजाइम की प्रोटीन in nature, beta lactamase. So beta lactamase is penicillinase. So अगर हम पेनिसिलिन को दे भी रहे हैं तो दे विल एक्चुअली डिस्ट्रॉय पेनिसिलिन, उसको ब्रेक डाउन कर देंगे. ठीक है, सो जो रेजिस्टेंट बैक्टीरिया है, बैक्टीरिया विच आर रेजिस्टेंट टू पेनिसिलिन, दे हैव एक्चुअली developed code for production of this enzyme beta lactamase, also known as penicillinase. ठीक है, it will break down the penicillin. The penicillin would have no effect on these. ठीक है, then likewise penicillin would definitely have no effect on tuberculosis. ठीक है, it's a different bacteria. Its wall is impermeable, it has a thicker wall, right? So impermeable wall, as well as it also has an enzyme which can break down penicillin, right? Sometimes it might also happen the bacterial membranes can pump out the antibiotics. ठीक है, antibiotics दी भी तो their wall काम ही नहीं कर पाती है. ठीक है, just discuss about beta lactamase. Okay then, pathogens can develop resistance, yes. ठीक है, developing enzymes as we just discussed penicillinase, they would destroy the penicillin. ठीक है, and they would also, this antibiotic resistance would also develop in people who are misusing the antibiotic. ठीक है, for example like बगैर प्रिस्क्रिप्शन के ले लिए कि घर में बची भी पड़ी थी स्पेशली उसकी, वो खा ली, या कोर्स नहीं कंप्लीट किया था, 2 दिन में तबीयत सही हो गई, दे डू नॉट कंप्लीट द कोर्स. तो ऐसे लोगों में बैक्टीरियल जो बैक्टीरिया वो एंटीबायोटिक रेजिस्टेंट हो जाता है. सो दिस रेजिस्टेंस जो है बैक्टीरिया के अंदर, इट कैन बी ट्रांसमिटेड बाय 2 ways. वन इज नोन एज वर्टिकल, ठीक है, अदर इज हॉरिजॉन्टल. ठीक है, सो ये 2 इसकी ट्रांसमिशन होती है, वर्टिकल ट्रांसमिशन एंड हॉरिजॉन्टल ट्रांसमिशन. So vertical transmission is just think about it. Okay, bacteria actually we know is like reproduces asexually by binary fission. So you have one bacteria, ठीक है, और उसके बाद 2 daughter cell बन गए. सही है. So it asexually reproduces by binary fission. So the DNA of a bacterial chromosome is replicated, ठीक है, and the bacterial cell divides into 2, with each daughter cell receiving a copy of the chromosome. Bacteria reproduce like this very rapidly, on an average every 20 minutes. ठीक है, so one cell DNA replicate हो, one cell से 2 cell बने, ठीक है, every 20 minutes की replication होती रहती है. If one bacterium contains a mutant gene that gives its antibiotic resistance, all of its descendants, है बता अगर एक बैक्टीरिया ऑलरेडी ये म्यूटेंट था, उसके अंदर जो जीन था, तो वो दूसरे उसकी डॉटर सेल्स में भी जाएगा. ठीक है, एंड विद इन लाइक मैटर ऑफ आवर्स जो उसकी सारी पॉपुलेशन बनती चली जाएगी, दे वुड आल्सो बी एंटीबायोटिक रेजिस्टेंट. इस मेथड को हम बोलते हैं वर्टिकल ट्रांसमिशन. ठीक है, दिस मेथड इज स्प्रेडिंग एंटीबायोटिक रेजिस्टेंस विद इन अ बैक्टीरियल पॉपुलेशन. रिमेंबर, विद इन अ बैक्टीरियल पॉपुलेशन इज नोन एज वर्टिकल ट्रांसमिशन. ठीक है, फ्रॉम वन बैक्टीरियल सेल एज इट अंडरगोस बाइनरी फिशन एसेक्सुअली. ठीक है, तो दोनों डॉटर सेल्स के अंदर चला जाएगा वो. ठीक है, हॉरिजॉन्टल ट्रांसमिशन क्या होता है, लाइक bacteria also have plasmids as well, which are small rings of DNA. ठीक है, and they are present in bacterial cells. So these plasmids, they contain antibiotic resistant genes. ठीक है, so these plasmids are frequently transferred between bacteria, and this transmission is even from one species to another. So जैसे हम vertical में जब पढ़े थे, तो it is like bacterial cell और अपने daughter cells में transfer कर रहा है. यहाँ पे क्या हो रहा है, प्लाज्मिड्स के थ्रू प्लाज्मिड्स are frequently transferred between bacteria even from one species to another, and the process in which this occurs is conjugation. ठीक है, so conjugation के अंदर क्या होता है, a thin tube forms between the two bacteria. So दोनों bacteria which can be of different species, the thin tube forms, ठीक है, and it allows the exchange of DNA. ठीक है, so DNA exchange हो जाता है इस tube के through. A DNA from the bacterial chromosome can also be transferred in this way. ठीक है, तो अब अगर फॉर एग्जाम्पल ये DNA already contained that mutant gene there, so it will definitely, or it is already antibiotic resistant, so it can be transferred to the other bacteria, और however हालांकि वो उसके different species होगा. ठीक है, so this is how actually superbugs with multiple resistance are developed. ठीक है, तो इसके एक एग्जाम्पल है MRCA, which is methicillin resistant staphylococcus aureus. ठीक है, so these are superbugs. This method of spreading antibiotic resistance within और between bacterial populations is known as horizontal transmission. ठीक है, तो ये बेसिकली कैसे हो रहा है, the process of conjugation, जहाँ DNA material exchange हो रहा है. ठीक है, so it can be within the bacterial population or within different species as well. So antibiotic resistance in bacteria is an example of natural selection. ठीक है, as humans have developed, definitely this is due to overuse of antibiotics in situations where they were not really necessary or the incorrect use of antibiotics. For example, for the treatment of non-serious infections, ठीक है, routine treatment to animals and agriculture, failure to finish the prescribed course of antibiotics. ठीक है, so ये सारी चीजें, ठीक है, अपनी ही गलती की वजह से इंसान की, ठीक है, बैक्टीरिया कैन बिकम रेजिस्टेंट, फिर उसके ऊपर एंटीबायोटिक असर नहीं कर रही. So here are the images of vertical transmission. See, so let's say कि this one has actually develop this antibiotic resistant strain. अब इसकी जो generation है, तो see, it contains, जैसे अब इनमें से जो भी बनेगा, so they eventually will be the पूरी की पूरी generation ऐसी बन जाएगी which is antibiotic resistant. So you have some of them which are like जो non resistant है, ठीक है, and some of them which are resistant. तो अब antibiotic देंगे भी तो वो non resistant को खत्म कर देगी, resistant strains वालों को खत्म नहीं करेंगी, तो now they will have no competition, so they will keep on growing. ठीक है, this one is horizontal transmission. So horizontal transmission is simply like it can be between the like same species के bacterium में होता है, but it's actually the exchange of genetic material. ठीक है, so different processes हैं. For example, जैसे ये अगर for example, if I read it from here, ठीक है, so 3 mechanisms. One is known as transformation, the first one that they've shown you. ठीक है, so this is what is happening when bacteria is like scavenge resistant genes from a dead bacterial cell. So these are dead bacterial cells. ठीक है, तो इसके अंदर से जो रेजिस्टेंट जीन है ये स्कैवेंजर है. ठीक है, तो इसने इसके अंदर चला गया. ठीक है, देन सेकंड इज नोन एज ट्रांसडक्शन. सो ट्रांसडक्शन में एक्चुअली दीज आर बैक्टीरियोफेजेस. बैक्टीरियोफेजेस आर द वायरसेस व्हिच इन्फेक्ट अ बैक्टीरिया. ठीक है, सो अब वही अगर ये म्यूटेंट इसके अंदर जीन था तो दिस विल बी टेकन अप बाय द वायरस. अब दिस बैक्टीरियोफेज, तो द वायरस व्हिच एक्चुअली इन्फेक्ट्स द बैक्टीरिया इज नोन एज बैक्टीरियोफेज. ठीक है, अब यही वायरस आके किसी और दूसरे बैक्टीरिया को जब आके वो करेगा तो इट विल टेक द स्ट्रेन विद इट. तो जो म्यूटेंट जीन है उसके साथ साथ चला जाएगा. तो अदर विल बी आल्सो है कैरिंग द सेम रेजिस्टेंट जीन. ठीक है, थर्ड वन दिस इज कॉन्जुगेशन एज वी वर डिस्कसिंग, जहाँ पे प्लाज्मिड्स के थ्रू ये एक्सचेंज हो रहा है. ठीक है, एंड द ट्यूब्स दैट डेवलप बिटवीन दीज टू आर नोन एज पाइलाई. ठीक है, सो वर्टिकल ट्रांसमिशन इज ओनली रिस्पॉन्सिबल फॉर पासिंग ऑन antibiotic resistance within a single bacterial population, whereas horizontal transmission can spread antibiotic resistance within a single population of bacteria or between two populations of same species of bacteria or occasionally between population of different species of bacteria. So this is the difference between vertical transmission and horizontal transmission. So the effective use of antibiotic includes the widespread use of antibiotic actually can lead to multiple resistance. We just saw that, right? One plasmid carrying resistance for one plasmid can actually carry resistance for many antibiotics. ठीक है, so it should be used sparingly, only used against bacteria, not viruses. ठीक है, then how can we reduce this antibiotic resistance and its impact? So tighter controls in countries in which antibiotics are sold without a doctor's prescription. ठीक है, so again हमारे मुल्क में ये है एक प्रॉब्लम. ठीक है, कि like कहीं भी जाके आप मेडिकल स्टोर से you can take any antibiotic without prescription, आराम से मिल जाती है. So वहाँ पे हमें ये basically ये rules regulations follow कराने. Doctors avoiding the overuse of antibiotics prescribing them only when needed. So doctors को also भी अपनी वहाँ पे medical practices को basically properly वहाँ पे use करना है, ठीक है? So they should avoid overuse of antibiotics, prescribe ना करें जब ज़रूरत नहीं है, ठीक है? So what should they do? They should test for the bacteria first, ठीक है? They make sure कि वही particular bacteria मौजूद है and then they give correct antibiotic, ठीक है? Then antibiotics should not be used in non-serious infections, ठीक है? That the immune system will clear up. हमारा अपना ही immune system बहुत सारे infections को clear कर देता है, तो ज़रूरत ही नहीं होती हर चीज़ के लिए आपको antibiotic लेने की, ठीक है? So patients must not keep unused antibiotics for self-medication or such non-serious infections in the future as well. When prescribed a course of antibiotics, patients should be finishing the entire course even if they feel better after a few days, so that all the bacteria are killed and none is left to mutate to become resistant strains. Then antibiotics should never be used for viral infections because they have no effect on virus. because antibiotic का basically काम क्या है, किसी भी inhibit करना process को bacteria के या cell wall को damage करना. तो cell wall है नहीं virus के अंदर, तो it cannot has any effect on the viruses. And this just provides an unnecessary chance of bacteria to develop resistance. सारी बात आप दिए जा रहे bacteria वहाँ पे है ही नहीं, तो resistant हो जाएंगे bacteria. ठीक है? Similarly, the use of wide spectrum antibiotics or sometimes they're known as broad spectrum antibiotics. For example, हमारे augmentin बहुत prescribed की जाती है, ठीक है? So this should be reduced. ठीक है? Instead of those antibiotics, there are highly specific. आप ऐसी दें which are specific to the infection. Some narrow spectrum antibiotics दें, ठीक है? Instead of giving them wide spectrum या broad spectrum antibiotics. The type of antibiotics prescribed being changed, ठीक है? So it's not कि आपने एक दफा एक antibiotic अगली दफा उसको change करें. Do not give the same antibiotic, ठीक है? Because this reduces the chance of a resistant strain developing. Basically जाहिर बात है, आप अगर एक ही दोबारा से वही वाली दे दी तो उसमें बहुत chances होते हैं कि bacteria antibiotic resistant हो जाए. So you need to reduce this chance. The use of antibiotics being reduced, ठीक है, and more tightly controlled in industries such as agriculture. ठीक है, तो वहाँ पे भी एंटीबायोटिक का यूज कम करना है. Controls are now in place to limit the use in farming, where antibiotics are used to prevent rather than cure the bacterial infections. ठीक है? So the spread of already resistant strains can be limited. अब ये spread हम कैसे रोक सकते हैं? Ensuring good health hygiene practices, hand washing, use of hand sanitizers. ठीक है? This has reduced the rates of resistant strains of bacteria such as MRSA in hospitals. Isolating the infected patients to prevent the spread of resistant strains, in particular surgical wards where MRSA can infect the surgical wounds. ठीक है? क्योंकि already उस केस में भी patient community already कम होती है. ठीक है? तो you need to isolate those patients. So this is how antibiotic resistance can be limited. And with that, we are done with the chapter. Thank you.